These slides are a simplified version of what I used in the lecture, with some voiceover in places where I think that will help to make them clearer. Quite a few of the slides, if you read the text on the slides, they should be quite clear in themselves. It would be useful to you, I think, to have the full version of the handout available, because that gives you quotes and references and things like that which aren't available actually on the slides. This isn't anything like as good as the original lecture, of course, and you don't get the images from the lecture, which were striking and maybe disturbing images by a Polish poster artist, well worth looking at. There's a link on the reading, I think, where you can go to the site to see some of his work. If you didn't come to the lecture, I think perhaps the slides don't make much sense by themselves, so perhaps this voiceover will help. Though actually, if you go and do the reading, that often helps to understand as well. But if you did go to the lecture, I hope this will be a useful reminder. There isn't a real argument or answer here. I'm just describing a number of ways in which madness can be understood, dealt with, both within psychology and outside psychology, to give you an idea of the different kinds of frameworks you could apply. Part of my case here is to suggest that mental illness is culturally determined, and the kinds of explanations and even the kinds of behaviours you get will vary from time to time and culture to culture. But it's worth pointing out that there are perhaps some basic ideas which apply in all kinds of times and all kinds of places. The study you see here was done with people who had virtually no contact with Western ideas, but when asked about what could go wrong with people's lives, they come up with ideas, ways of talking about it, which seem very sensible and seem to overlap with ours quite well. Here's another description of madness as delusion from Lang's work, which we'll come back to later. The statements here seem, again, quite straightforward. These are kinds of things which we think are mad statements. But delusion is a bit complicated. We all believe things which are not the case, or which turn out not to have been the case in the long run, or in different centuries don't seem to be the case. The first three of these were things which people did believe, but on the whole we don't believe now. The last one is something which seems a very extreme statement, but if you take it apart carefully, it might not be deluded. How about these statements? The first two might seem deluded or just not sensible. The third one is a fairly straightforward statement of an existential crisis. People, unfortunately, might feel like this. The fourth one, though, is clearly mad in terms of the criteria that Lang gives, but you can see it as an extreme way, perhaps, a metaphorical way of putting the point that you've got in the statement just above it. So delusion may well be a symptom of madness, but delusion is a bit difficult to describe and may be culturally conditioned. As scientists, of course, we think that one way of coming to an understanding of madness is to categorize it, and the psychoses are categorized traditionally, in the way that Kraepelin defined at the end of the 19th century, manic depression and schizophrenia. This kind of categorization steadily developed, and now we have the American Psychological Association's DSM. This is a guide to diagnosis and also a guide to treatment, and as that becomes part of an industry. It was a very, very profitable undertaking for the APA, and it became the manual of American psychiatry. Since American psychiatry is funded by health insurance payments, then the DSM became the blueprint by which things became diagnosed and treated, and psychiatrists had to do it that way, otherwise they wouldn't get paid and the patient wouldn't get treated. The classifications and definitions of the DSM are widely accepted, but they have been challenged. And Richard Bentall's book, Madness Explained, there are lots of copies in the library, in its early chapters spells this out, pointing out that actually, if you look at the pattern of diagnoses, it's not very reliable. This slide is an example of that. You may find it difficult to read the table off the screen, so you can perhaps just take my word for it or look up the original, the reference is there. What this table shows that if you take 700 odd psychotic patients and look at their symptoms according to various diagnostic criteria, you can see the DSM in the middle, but there are others that are used widely, you find that the same patient could be put into different categories by the different categorization systems. This doesn't look like a very consistent and valid measure. If you go back to the original symptoms and factor analyze them, as Little has done, the reference is in Bentall's book, he came up with a pattern which showed 3 separate kinds of symptoms: hallucinations and delusions, negative symptoms, emotional flatness, withdrawal, and so on, and disorganization. And these 3 occurred fairly independently, so someone diagnosed as schizophrenic might have 1, 2, or 3 of them in various degrees. Worse still, perhaps schizophrenia is not completely different from other disorders like bipolar disorder and depression. The same kind of factor analysis of patients with these symptoms came up with similar areas. There are differences in terms of how often different factors came up in the different disorders, but perhaps overall schizophrenia is not a simple one-factor disorder, and the 3 big areas, schizophrenia, bipolar and depression, maybe are not so different from each other after all. I have to point out that although Bentall makes a convincing case in this book, the basic categorization system set out in the DSM-4 is pretty generally accepted by most psychiatrists and psychologists. Okay, a new topic: madness as inconvenient behaviour.